All right. So now that you have finished your second midterm, let's move on. Okay. Okay. Just make sure. Okay. So the nervous system, okay, is the master control communication system. It has three overlapping functions. Okay. One, the sensory receptors monitor changes inside and outside the body. Okay. So if you sit there and think about what's going on, exactly are you measuring? What sensory receptors? What are you measuring? It actually ends up being a lot. Okay. So if you think about it easily, the eyes see stuff, you smell stuff. Okay. You taste stuff. You have a sense of balance. Okay. Those are the special senses, and then you have general senses like temperature and touch, and then you have the internal sensory reception, the stretch receptors inside your body, the temperature receptors inside your body, the calcium receptors inside your body, etc., etc., etc. Okay, all of that has to be detected and updated constantly. Okay, and so the stimulus is the changes that are detected, and then the sensory input is gathered by the receptors. And finally, it goes somewhere. That somewhere is the integration center. Okay, it's a term for interpreting input. Okay, and it dictates a response by the effector organs. Okay, the effector organs is also known as the motor output. Okay, the movement associated. Okay, so sensory input. Okay, I see some water. Okay, so here's my sensory input. This thing here is the neuron here. Okay, this is a sensory neuron. This is the inner neuron where it's integrated, and then this is the motor neuron that produces the motor output. Okay, so we've looked at this tiny little bit here. Okay. Oops. Okay. So the basic division of the nervous system, the CNS, okay, is composed of the brain and spinal cord, is an integrating command center, and then you have the PNS. Okay, the PNS consists of everything extending from the brain and spinal cord. So the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Okay, and the ganglia. Okay, the ganglia are clusters of neuronal cell bodies. Okay, so I'm gonna explain something really quickly. Okay, and that is I need. Okay, sorry, I can't draw. Again. Okay. So some terminology. This is CNS, and this is PNS. Okay. Okay, so terminology, okay? So when we talk about the cells, we break them down to the cell body and the axon. In a CNS, the cell body, a group of cell bodies is called a nucleus, a group of axons is called a tract. In a PNS, a group of cell bodies is called ganglia, a group of axons is called a nerve, okay? Okay, so here you can see the ganglia and the nerves here, okay, and then the CNS is just there. All right, sensory, okay, and motor. Sensory signals are afferent signals. Okay, afferent means to somewhere, so they go to the CNS. Efferent, okay, E means from. So efferent signals come from the CNS to the body. Okay. Okay, so we divide the the input and output based on body region. So somatic and visceral. Somatic means the outside, visceral means the inside. Okay, so somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, visceral motor. Okay, so CNS, PNS. This is sensory. This is motor. The motor is split into sensory motor and visceral motor, also known as the ANS. Okay, the sensory is also split into the somatic sensory and the visceral sensory as well. Okay, the autonomic nervous system is further split into sympathetic and parasympathetic, which we'll talk about later. Okay, the basic divisions of the nervous system. We'll skip these guys. Okay. Okay. We'll cover those things in a later chapter, which we'll talk about later. Okay. Nervous tissue. The cells are densely packed and intertwined, and there's two major types: neurons and support cells. Okay, and we already learned this again in chapter 4. Okay, neurons transmit electrical signals. Okay, the support cells, okay, are neuroglial cells. They're non-excitable, but they surround and protect the neurons. Okay, so neurons are good at doing one thing and one thing only, and that is to transmit electrical signal. Okay, they're capable of feeding themselves and stuff, so they need support cells to actually do it. All right. Neurons are the basic structural unit of the nervous system. Okay, they're specialized cells that conduct electrical impulses along the plasma membrane. So you have a nerve impulse, which is also known as the action potential. Okay, so some special characteristics of neurons. One is they're really long-lived. Okay, you're born with most of the neurons that you die with. So they live and function for a lifetime. Okay, they also divide. Okay, fetal neurons lose their ability to undergo mitosis. Okay, so like once the neuron is dead, it isn't coming back. Okay, you can develop new pathways, and you do. Like, you know, if you have a stroke, you can relearn things and relearn how to use like muscles and stuff. But that takes that is actually development of the neurons that you still have. Okay, neurons have a very high metabolic rate. Okay, they use energy more than other places, and so they also require abundant oxygen and glucose. So neurons preferentially depend on glucose. In fact, the only other thing they really use are ketone bodies. So they require abundant oxygen and glucose to do that. So if I ever cut off, say, you know, your oxygen supply, neurons die first. Okay. Okay. The neural cell body, okay? So here, okay, this is a cell body. The cell body has a whole bunch of stuff in it. That stuff is actually the ER and free ribosomes holding it, hanging around. The neurons produce a huge amount of protein, which makes them like have this big rough ER and free ribosomes. Okay, and when we first named them, we didn't know what we were looking at, so we called them chromatophilic bodies because they picked up chromatophils, which is color. Okay, the stain they picked up was something called a missile stain, so we also call them missile bodies. Okay. All right. You don't have to know neurofibrils. Okay. Okay. Most neural cell bodies are located within the CNS. The neural cell bodies in the PNS are ganglia. Okay. So here is one of the neural cell bodies in the PNS. Okay. Okay, dendrites. Okay. Dendrites extensively branch from the cell body. What they do is they transmit electrical signals toward the cell body, so that dendrites are the receivers of information. Okay, the chromatophilic bodies only extend to the basal part of the dendrites and to the base of the axon hillock. Okay, axons, they only have one axon, so every neuron has one axon. Okay, that axon is the impulse generator and conductor. So the axon, so here's the axon. So the axon starts at this region right here called the axon hillock. Okay, the axon is only capable of one thing really, and that is either to fire or not fire. That is a all or none response, which you'll learn about in physio. Okay, so the axon can determine to fire or not fire, and if it fires, the signal goes down the axon to the very end where it splits. Okay, and that is called the terminal arborization. So arborization is literally means arbor, so tree branching. Okay, the very tips are called the terminal boutons, or otherwise known as the axon terminals. Okay. Okay. The nerve impulse is generated initial segment of the axon, called the axon hillock. It's conducted along the axon to the terminal boutons. Okay, and at the very end of the terminal bouton, you have the neurotransmitters that are released from vesicles. Okay, and we already saw that when we talked about muscle. That's the acetylcholine release that we talked about. Okay, and the site at which neurons communicate are the synapses. Like I said, the synapses are a big deal, and how you modulate the synapses changes a lot of things. Okay. I don't know if you can hear that. Shit.
Synapses may be either chemical. Neurons communicate across junctions called synapses. When an action potential arrives at the end of an axon, A signal is transmitted across a synapse to a receiving cell. Although synapses may be either chemical or electrical, we will only look at a chemical synapse in detail. How do signals travel across a chemical synapse?
Okay. So a synapse has a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So here, postsynaptic, presynaptic, postsynaptic. Okay. Don't worry about type of synapses. So what happens is here you have, like, you remember a similar picture with the neuron here, but instead of another neuron here, it was a muscle here. But this is basically the same thing. Okay, the signal comes down, the electrical signal comes down, and it changes the chemical signal here. The releases calcium, and then these guys release the neurotransmitters into this cleft right here, and that binds to stuff right here. Okay. All right. The way we classify neurons, okay, are based on the structural classification first. So bipolar, multipolar, and unipolar. So let's look at what this means. Okay, so here you look at the cell body, and here you see one thing sticking out of it. So one, unipolar. So these are unipolar. These are bipolar. So two. Okay, and then here more than two, multipolar. Okay, so all of these have one axon, so axon, axon, axon. This one, this one technically has one dendrite. This one technically has one axon and many, many, many dendrites. Okay, so here you see how they actually differ and what they actually look like. Okay. The other classification of neurons is the type, what they do. Okay, sensory neurons, okay, transmit information toward the CNS. Efferent neurons or motor neurons transmit information away from the CNS. Okay, interneurons travel in between the sensory and the motor neurons. Okay, they stay completely within the CNS. Okay. Okay. The neuroglial. So I'll actually pick this up in part 2. So we'll stop right here. I know this is kind of short, but we'll stop right here. I'll pick this up in part 2.